But Abraham being the first Jew, sort of inside, he knew them all. He observed them all even without having to be told. He was the first Jew. Early Christian interpreters make Abraham into effectively the first Christian. So in the same way that Jews have traditions about how Abraham knew all of the laws, for Christians who rejected the laws, what Abraham knew in his soul without having to be told was the Ten Commandments, right? They were in there, right? And that's, that was part of what made him special. Both of these traditions were thinking about Abraham as like again as a new beginning, right? As seen through the lens of these later faiths, right? So what does a new beginning mean if from a Jewish perspective? It means he's the first Jew. What does a new beginning mean from a Christian perspective? It means he was effectively, sort of the first Christian. Um, so the rabbis are doing this. Paul does this. We'll come back to Paul a little bit later, but only in passing. Don't ask me too much about Paul. That's the wrong testament for me. But what I want to suggest is, in terms of the Bible itself and the stories that we have, there's nothing new about Abraham. There's nothing unique about Abraham as a person. The call of Abraham is a story about selection, not about recognition, right? That is to say, it's not that Abraham proves himself worthy in any way in the story. He's just picked. There's no explanation for it. So we might ask ourselves quite logically, why Abraham? Why was Abraham the one who got selected to play this role in sort of the great history? A better question actually may be, well, why anyone? Why was this the way that the story went, that God had to choose someone to start with, right? To call. We have to think back to where we were in the story actually before this, right? We think of Abraham as a new beginning, but there's all this stuff that's happened before. And what happened right before this in the story is the Tower of Babel, right? Which, again, sadly, we didn't have time to go over here, much as I love the Tower of Babel story. But in the Tower of Babel story, what we've got is, right, a story about all of humanity operating together and it really not working out well, right? So why choose an individual? Well, because it turned out trying to work with, the entirety of humanity at once was a little unwieldy. And so the selection of Abraham is kind of like, well, let's try a different approach. Right? And if that feels weird, right, this is the same God who we saw in Eden, right, who made a human and then was like, maybe he's going to get lonely. Let's try some stuff. We'll throw some animals against the wall and see if anything sticks. Right, same God of the second flood story, right? The one who's like, I don't like the way this is going. Let me start again. Actually, I really like the sacrifices. Maybe we'll just keep things the way they are. Right? This is a God who, especially at the beginning, is kind of trying things out. Right? And after the Tower of Babel, the thing that God tries out is, okay, if everybody at once didn't work, what if just one person works? And then the next question we might want to ask ourselves is, works for what? What is it that God is trying to accomplish here? Or to put it in terms that maybe people could be a tiny bit uncomfortable with, but that I think are actually quite appropriate to the story and the way that they were thinking was, what is it that God needs? What is it that God needs from humans? And it seems, and again, thinking about the same God from that second flood story who really likes sacrifices, what God needs is people to obey and to worship. That's what God needs from humanity. Worship, right? That's, I think, what most of the gods in the ancient Near East were understood to need. Affection, sacrifice, worship, obedience. So that's the rationale behind the selection of Abraham. Again, not Abraham in particular, but there's rationale behind the selection of someone. I do want to take a quick moment to talk about this notion of Abraham as the first Jew, which is, I think, very common, is what I grew up with. But I want to suggest that there's something a little bit problematic about it, in part because what it does is it conflates Judaism, which is a religion that exists today in the world, and ancient Israelite religion, which is a religion that existed back then in ancient Israel. When we say Abraham was the first Jew, we're essentially eliding a quite significant distinction between ancient Israelite religion and Judaism. Judaism is a set of, as every religion is really, a set of practices and beliefs, right, that is centered around the interpretation of older texts, the biblical texts, but isn't identical with those texts, right? The religion of the Hebrew Bible is one that centers around bloody animal sacrifice at a central temple. Judaism is not that religion. It's unclear, or at least it's not, there's no like bright dividing line for when ancient Israelite religion ends and what we think of now as Judaism begins. It certainly wasn't before the exile in the 6th century. It was almost certainly considerably later than that. And as a basic rule, with the exception of maybe the very, very latest books, maybe a book like Daniel, there is no Judaism in the Hebrew Bible. So why is this important? Why am I taking this opportunity to mention it? Because I think that this is a mistake that's made often enough that it's worth pointing to, and it has repercussions that are usually very unintentional. But the identification of Judaism with the religion of the Bible, with ancient Israelite religion, with the sacrificial cult of the temple, and that identification can sometimes lead to supersessionism, insofar as it reads Judaism as like, it makes Judaism ancient. Judaism is Old Testament, and then of course followed by New, right? Judaism becomes part of the like narrative structure going back to the Hebrew Bible that leads into the New Testament and toward Jesus, right? It makes Judaism an ancient cult rather than a living religion. Of course, Christianity does come out of Judaism, but not really as like much later as you'd think if you start calling Abraham the first Jew, right? Both Judaism and Christianity really start to emerge from basically the same cultural milieu at the same time and largely the same place. And both Christianity and Judaism are based on the interpretation of ancient Israelite texts and ancient Israelite beliefs. Right? So Judaism is a community of interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, but it's not the Hebrew Bible itself. And in that sense, Abraham was not the first Jew. Abraham was really just the first Israelite. And like, nobody tell Jacob that Abraham was the first Israelite, right? That's an interfamily fight that they can have later. Okay. So let's get to the actual stuff. We get to Genesis 12 and the call of Abraham. Famous lines where God tells Abraham, right, go forth from your native land and your father's house to the land that I will show you. It's almost so obvious that we don't think about it, but Abraham doesn't originally come from Israel, right? There is in fact nothing obvious about that, right? Why on earth would the traditional claim not have been that Abraham was from Canaan, right? From Israel? What is gained from the perspective of the story by having Abraham come from somewhere else? So it's an interesting situation that Israel finds itself in, as a people who is sort of self-aware that they're not native to the land that they live in. And this goes back in part to this, there's a myth that pops its head up occasionally in the Hebrew Bible. A myth about how did all the peoples of the world end up where they are? is basically the question. And this comes up, a good example is Deuteronomy 32, which I'm giving to you here in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, because it is, we all think, closer to the original text. What's the story? The story is the high God, the Most High, might be Israel's God, might not. When that God gave the nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of gods. So the notion behind this myth is there was a moment when there were all the humans and all the gods, and the high God, perhaps Israel's God, said, okay, so this people goes in this land with this deity. They belong here, and this other one belongs here, and that's how everybody ended up where they are. And this is a reasonable explanation, given its context, for why it is that people in different places worship different gods. Right? They look around. How come the Ammonites next door worship a god named Milcom? And how come the Moabites worship a god named Chemosh? And how come the Canaanites worship a god named Baal, etc.? This is why, because they all got assigned early on. But according to the story, Israel's God, Yahweh, chose Israel. So, but where they didn't have land, right? Israel knows that they ended up in this other place, in a place where the Canaanites lived, right? Because they know, even in the chapter that we're reading now, right, in Genesis 12, the Canaanites were then in the land. This is Canaanite territory that Israel is inhabiting, right? So what's happened is Canaan was assigned to the Canaanites with the Canaanite deities back in the mythic past. And so for Israel to sort of plant its seeds there, it can't be native because we're not Canaanites, right? We must have come from elsewhere. So there's an awareness in the story, an awareness from Israel of its own sort of minority status within its cultural context. And perhaps even the awareness that the worship of their God, of Israel's God, was a novelty in this space, right? People in Canaan weren't worshiping Yahweh, they were worshiping Baal. So the idea that Abraham comes from elsewhere is a common idea to all of the stories about him. But there aren't uniform claims as to actually where it is that Abraham came from, right? Famously, right, he comes from Ur of the Chaldeans, which is Mesopotamia. But right, from an equally famous passage, my father was a wandering Aramean, he seems to have come from Aram. Right? And there are definitely stories in Genesis about how Abraham's family is in Aram, up to the north, rather than all the way in Mesopotamia. So again, we're dealing with a tradition of Abraham having been born outside of the land, but a tradition that's malleable and can be picked up in different ways by different people in different times. None of the specifics of which matter much, right? What matters is that Abraham is an outsider, right? And that outsider status seems to have been a matter of historical and social knowledge. And that outsider status is something of a mechanism, this whole call story is a mechanism for claiming Abraham's and Israel's right to this land, right? Again, totally aware that the Canaanites lived here first. So why are we here? Why are we Israel in this land that belonged to the Canaanites? Because God gave it to us all the way back with Abraham. God gave it to us, and therefore we have a right to it, right? This land, he didn't give us any other land. And so despite there being others here who have a better right to it, maybe historically, we're still laying claim to it because, right, this is the land that God showed us. In other words, the call of Abraham, at least in this version, is like, it's kind of like manifest destiny, like ancient Israel style. It is worth thinking, given that analogy I just made, it's worth thinking for a bit then about the status of the indigenous Canaanites in the story. Right? Our biblical tradition obviously vilifies them. They're the enemy. They're the Baal worshippers. They're the sexual deviants, right? The Bible says all sorts of nasty things about these Canaanites. But we in America, at least, should like see this and know better from an ethical perspective, right? That we should be able to identify more, or at least we should be able to identify with the native Canaanite population that is being, in the story that Israel tells itself, is being displaced and dispossessed. Um, Israel admits that Canaan and the Canaanites were there first. What does that mean for the fact that Israel's there now and the Canaanites aren't? Uh, the Genesis tradition here is basically a colonialist one. And the idea of the land being some sort of God-given right, we need to recognize as a rhetorical move, one that we know from the present, and one that's also quite ancient. Okay, having done that, now let's turn to actually the promise of Genesis 12 itself. So I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, is how it begins. A great nation requires two things. It requires land and people to inhabit that land. If you don't have either one of those, you don't have a great nation. And land and people aren't said explicitly here, but the phrase great nation encapsulates them. They're here. The whole of the Pentateuch is basically the story of the fulfillment of this promise. I will make you a great nation. From the end of Genesis, when Jacob and his family leaves Canaan to go to Egypt, from that moment until the very end of the Pentateuch, what's at stake is the land. What's at stake is the land, and how can they get there, right? Suddenly they're not in it anymore. They have to travel 40 years through the wilderness. They have to, battles, etc. The land is what's at stake from Joseph through the end. Much of Genesis is about the question of progeny, of offspring, and how are we actually going to get that? And that question begins even before the promise is given, when we learn that Sarah is barren, right? As, of course, are Rebecca, Rachel, and even Leah for a bit. Barrenness evidently runs not in the family, because none of the women are related, but runs in the patriarchal in-law side. So I want to, for the sake of being here, I would just like a really brief word, since, as you can tell by now, I think or have thought a lot about questions of fertility and infertility in the Bible. So just really, really briefly on this tradition of the matriarchs being barren, and the way that these stories get used in contemporary discourse. Right? It is very tempting to read these stories through a positive light. After all, here are prominent female characters who are infertile and who it's very clear from the story are entirely blameless, right? So the tendency that may exist to blame women somehow, right? If you are infertile, you must have done something wrong. It must be punishment. These stories are a really wonderful rebuttal of that, because Sarah did nothing wrong, right? None of them did anything wrong to deserve this. It just happened. That's a very positive takeaway. The more problematic one is none of them stay infertile. And the way that they change from infertility to fertility is sometimes prayer, right? Complaining a little bit to God, which unfortunately puts out there the notion that prayer is healing in this way. And so now what do we do if if for an infertile woman who believes and sees this as an example and prays and her infertility doesn't change, that becomes a failing, right? That looks like a failing on her part, right? Something must be wrong. So it's a complicated, right? It's a complicated situation. And I just think generally we need to be very careful with how we talk about and use this. How do we use these stories as models for contemporary issues of fertility? Okay, moving along. I will make your name great. I will make your name great it really actually gets at what is perhaps one of the most important aspects of this promise, which is there's a reputational aspect here, right? I will make your name great, right? People will know you. Reputation is very much at stake. And in here, you may notice, right, the making of the name great. There's an allusion here to the Tower of Babel story, right? What is it that they wanted in the Tower of Babel? They wanted to build a city and a tower with a top in the sky to make a name for ourselves. And part of the lesson here, and in the shift from the Tower of Babel to Abraham, is humans are not capable of making names for ourselves in that way, right? Um, that is God's responsibility. God, so after the humans try and fail to make a name for themselves, God says to Abraham, "I'll make your name great." But I'll note that in that, right, this reputational stuff, it's Abraham is blessed not just for his own sake, but for the future, right? For other people to see. And again, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. The way that others perceive Abraham is key to the entire endeavor that God is suggesting here. And the final line makes this even more clear. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. So before I get to the translation, I want to point out one of the things that's actually hard to see in translation here is that within the syntax of the Hebrew, this is the goal, right? All of the other stuff, I'll bless you, I'll make your name great, you'll be a blessing, I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Those are all happening sort of at the same time in terms of the Hebrew syntax, and they're all aiming at this end goal. The end goal is all the families of the earth, right? So the whole call of Abraham really has to do not just with Abraham. It has to do with other people. So what I want to point out in terms of this line, which is important, all the families of the earth shall be blessed by you, or shall bless themselves by you. This is a translation issue. The Jewish Publication Society translation says they will bless themselves by you. And the NRSV, which is obviously a Christian translation, says they shall be blessed in you. Right. So I've said it before and I'll say it again. All translation is interpretation. Okay. So from the Christian perspective, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, right, has a particular ring to it, and becomes an aspect of thinking about the relationship of the new Israel, Christianity, with the rest of the world. Whereas in Judaism, all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. What's imagined isn't some sort of isn't that Abraham's obedience will somehow like spill over and bless others in sort of a miasmic, osmotic kind of way, but rather quite much more literally, when people bless each other, they will say, "May you be blessed like Abraham is." Right? That's the Jewish reading, and I think it probably is given the context closer to what is in mind here. Thinking about all of the issues of reputation and fame and being a model, right? That's what's wrapped up and at stake here in this call. Remember, what is it that God wants out of the call, out of calling Abraham or choosing Abraham at all, right? It's not just to be a benefit for Abraham and his family. It's so that others can see, right? What happens when someone follows Yahweh? Good things happen. I will bless you, right? You will be a blessing, right? And I will bless the people who bless you and curse the people who curse you. And people will say, "Boy, I wish I could be like Abraham." Right? Essentially, to put it a little bluntly, this promise to Abraham is marketing strategy, right? This is God saying, "All right, I'm going to choose one person and I'm going to reward him for following me. Everyone's going to see what the reward is and how good it is. And so they'll start doing the same thing." How is God going to get through to all of humanity? Again, the Tower of Babel story showed us that it wasn't all of everyone at once. I'll start with one. I'll make it real good for him. And everyone else will come around when they see. So again, actually, it's not that Abraham is especially deserving. In fact, if Abraham were especially deserving, it would kind of defeat the purpose, right? He's got to be an average guy. Right? Look what happened to this average guy, this nobody, this random dude, when he started obeying Yahweh, right? The whole enterprise works because he's not important, but he gets selected anyway. Okay. I want to take a brief moment to observe that God continues to detail the promise as Abraham wanders through the land in Genesis 12. When he first arrives in the land, he gets the real land promise, right? He arrives in Canaan and God says, this is the one. This is the land you're going to live in. And then in Genesis 13, after Abraham and Lot have separated, he says, okay, now this is the land you're going to have, and I'm going to even show you what its borders are now that you've separated from your cousin and or your nephew, and we're all good. And here is where we find the explicit promise of progeny. Right? I'll make your offspring as the dust of the earth. All of that is relevant because the weird thing about the call of Abraham is that it happens twice. It all seemed pretty settled back there in Genesis 12 and 13, but then we get to Genesis 15, which has actually a pretty strange opening. The word of the Lord came to Abram and said, don't be afraid, Abraham. I'll be a shield to you. So like, why would Abraham need to be afraid of anything? He's already gotten the promise. He's been promised the land. He's been promised progeny. What does he have to be afraid of? I've always heard this moment, and this may be a reference that not everyone gets, but I always read this and I think of there's a classic Monty Python sketch where John Cleese and Graham Chapman are airplane pilots, and they're messing with the people in the back. They're being like, don't worry, there's the plane is not on fire. Right? That's always what I hear God doing here, being like, don't be afraid, Abraham. Did I need to be worried about something? I had no idea. What is it that Abraham actually is worried about, though? He's worried about the fact that he's going to die childless. He's worried really about the immediate question of his inheritance. To whom is his inheritance going to go? Which is, again, a weird thing because Sarah's been barren since Genesis 11. He got the promise of being a great nation in Genesis 12, and then the promise of progeny in Genesis 13. Like that, this didn't occur to him at any of those moments. And once God says, no, I'll make sure that one of your own children is your heir, then God repeats the progeny promise in basically nearly identical terms, not dust of the earth, but stars of the sky. Okay, heard that promise already. And then it says, of course, that Abraham trusted in God and that God approved of it. And again, I think surely that too was settled already, right? When Abraham left home, I would have thought that would have been sufficient proof of Abraham's, trust in God. So, without getting too much into the weeds here, this repetition of the call narrative is a symptom of the different sources of the Pentateuch, the different original strands that went into its composition. There are in Genesis 12 and 15 two stories about the call of Abraham. And you might notice, right, how in 15:7 God introduces himself. I am the Lord who brought you. Like Abraham could be like, yeah, I know, dude. Like we did that. I was there. But suddenly, though, only now Abraham is like, wait, how do I know I'm going to possess this land? Why is he suddenly so? Why now is he suddenly so full of doubt? When actually now he's settled for a while. He's been there a bit. And why only now does God make a covenant around the giving of the land? Right? You already promised the land before. Why wasn't there a covenant there? Right. All of these are reasons that we might look and think this is two separate, parallel stories about Abraham being called and given the promise to be made a great nation. So I want to take a moment here to just look at a couple of the unique features of Genesis 15 about the second call narrative. This one obviously has like the crucial verse for Paul and for Christianity, which is Genesis 15:6. I've put up again the JPS and the NRSV translations, again simply to make the point that all translation is interpretation. And one of these is a pretty Christian reading of the text, right? The Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And one of them is less so, right? He reckoned it to his merit. He thought like, good, that's a check in the merit column for Abraham there. He's believing. I will, while I'm here, I will point out, if you're familiar, and I imagine most of us are, with the Paul's interpretation here, which is that this is a way of saying, right, what matters is faith, right, over works, right? Abraham believed, and that was righteousness, right? That was reckoned to him as righteousness. And therefore, it's the belief that matters, not the fulfillment of all of those laws. So I will point out another place where this same word that's translated merit or righteousness shows up, which is in Deuteronomy, where it says, "It will therefore be to our merit or our righteousness before the Lord our God to observe faithfully this whole instruction," that is the whole body of the law, right? So yeah, you can take it that way, and you can take it in Genesis 15 as being pro faith, but it's the same word and the same idea here in Deuteronomy, where it's definitely pro laws. All of this is just to say, in order to read this verse as promoting faith over works, you kind of have to have already decided that the laws that come later we're going to set aside. Because at this point in the narrative, no laws have even been given yet. There are no works that can be rejected here in favor of faith. In Genesis, the patriarchs get credit for their faith and their obedience. That's what they've got. And later in the story, their descendants are given laws to follow. So if we say faith yes, works no, right? Basically what we're saying is we're going with a story a certain way, but not all the way, right? At a certain point, we're jumping ship on the narrative, which is essentially what early Christians did, right? Following Paul. They said, yes, the narrative to a certain point, and when we start giving the laws, that wasn't us at all. But again, right, that's Christianity. That's not Genesis. And it's, useful to remember the difference between those two things. The other weird thing that happens in Genesis 15, or the other notable thing, is this crazy covenant ceremony. And you're not even going to have time to read the entire slide here. But right, this is the ceremony where like the animals, and they're cut in half and placed opposite each other. And then the sun sets and the torch passes between the pieces. Right? What kind of thing is this? First of all, what it is it's not unique, even in the Bible. Jeremiah, here's the text, refers to exactly this kind of making of a covenant, right? That cut a calf that they cut in two so as to pass between the halves. This is where we get the phrase "to cut a covenant." Is from this. It comes out of this, this process, which is very weird. Clearly, there's some old covenant making custom here, probably in which they cut an animal in two and they walked between it and said something like, if either of us breaks this treaty, may we end up cut in half, something like that. End up like this animal that we just walked between. So the ceremony may be quite distant to us, but in the middle of this covenant ceremony, with the pieces and the flamings and the animals and everything, in the middle of it, we get this prediction of the descent to Egypt and the Exodus, right? I'm giving you the land, but you should know you're strangers. You're often going to be strangers in a strange land. And again, we might think that's the kind of thing you could have mentioned earlier, right? When we went through all of this before. So now Abraham has received the promise twice, in 12 and 15. And the weird thing is, it happens again in Genesis 17, where God appears to Abraham and says, I'm El Shaddai. And Abraham could well be like, you weren't before, right? El Shaddai is a new one. It's a new one to us in the entire Bible. It's the first appearance of this name for God as a self-introduction. But we should be aware there's a whole series of texts in the patriarchal cycle, in the patriarchal episodes, where El Shaddai is the name of the deity. I am El Shaddai here. May El Shaddai bless you. Again, I'm El Shaddai. El Shaddai appeared to me. This divine name appears in sporadically, but consistently, and consistently in one of our Pentateuchal sources. In fact, it's a main claim of one of our sources, and it comes back again, you may know, in Exodus, when God says to Moses, when I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I appeared to them as El Shaddai. I never told them my real name, which I'm now telling you. So this new El Shaddai thing is like surprising, and especially given this, right? I didn't tell them my real name. We can think back to the other promises and be like, well, why didn't he introduce himself as El Shaddai then? back to 17, the beginning of 17, God says, walk in my ways and be blameless. Well, what has Abraham been doing since he left home? He's only been obedient. Every single story, Abraham does exactly what God says. Why does God have to say, walk in my ways now? Why does he have to say, I'm going to make a covenant with you? You just did that two chapters ago. Why do we have another promise of progeny, right? We've been here. We've been here twice already. And after this brief introduction, we get a longer version that just repeats what we've already seen, right? The same stuff. I'm going to make a covenant, right? I'm going to make you numerous. I'm going to give you offspring. I'm going to assign the land to you and to your offspring. The new item here is the change of Abraham's name, which is linked here to the progeny, right? I'm not going to call you Abram. I'm going to call you Abraham, right? With a pun on, the father of many nations. But again, the promise of progenies happened twice before. Why is God only changing Abraham's name now? Right? Why not the previous two times? Okay. Long story short, no surprise here. This is a third call of Abraham and a third literary source of the Pentateuch. And this is the source, by the way. Here in Genesis 17, this is the same narrative thread that goes back to Genesis 1 and the first flood story. How do I know? Say you can recognize it, right? It's a little bit split up here, but in 17:2 and 6, we get, I will multiply you greatly and I will make you very fruitful, right? So, right, be fruitful and multiply. That's the Genesis 1. That's the first flood story, right? That's that language and concept. And so here we have this continuity back with the Genesis 1 and the first flood story that we looked at. And in this story also we have, as I mentioned last time, another one of these covenantal signs, right? We talked about the rainbow as the covenantal sign, right? The reminder for God, right? Eventually I'm going to need to turn off the waterworks was the rainbow sign. Here we have a different covenant, obviously. Here the covenant is that Yahweh will be God to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants. Right? That's the promise. That's the covenant here. To be God to you and to your offspring to come. And the sign of this covenant, the sign of it is circumcision. How does this work? It's better we should be doing this in the evening than first thing in the morning. This covenant has to do with offspring, right? With future generations. Right? So what does circumcision have to do with offspring? We have to understand how ancient Israelites thought procreation worked. Fertility was not generally seen as like the natural state of all humans. They knew that not every act of intercourse leads to conception. So what explains the fact that sometimes does, sometimes doesn't? Divine intervention is needed. And this was a broad ancient Near Eastern belief. We have wonderful texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia, right? We have like diagrams of, how God needs to intervene. Even in the Bible, we have all this language of, right, God holds the key to the womb, for example. So the divine intervention is needed for intercourse to be procreative successfully. And what's being promised here to Abraham isn't just fertility, but super fertility. Right? Think about the other promises. I'll make you like the dust of the earth and the stars in the sky. Right? This isn't just, it'll be fine, right? This is, I got to start with you, one person. I got to make a whole nation out of you. So how is circumcision part of that plan? Like the rainbow, which God sees and remembers a promise that he made, so too circumcision. When two members of this family, Abraham's family descendants, when two members of this family have sex, God sees the circumcision and remembers, I got to make sure this coupling is a fertile one. That's the way this reminder works. The main difference between this covenantal sign and reminder and the one in the flood story is that God can make a rainbow himself. We can't. God makes the rainbow to remember. Or the rain makes the rainbow to remember. But God can't circumcise, right, Israelite children. So Abraham and his descendants have to make the sign of the covenant themselves, right? The sign is in their own flesh. which doesn't mean, as it's often understood, it doesn't mean that circumcision is a covenantal demand, right? This is not a two-sided thing. You circumcise yourselves, and in return, I promise to be your God, right? It's a promise. I promise to be your God. But Israel has like a human responsibility, to make sure that the reminder, the sign exists, right? Their job is to keep God's eye on the prize, a phrase for which I now apologize. So in this sense, actually, the circumcision sign is actually very much like a different sign, again, from our same Pentateuchal source, which is the blood on the doorposts during the death of the firstborn in Egypt, right? That's how, at that time, God distinguishes between Israelites and non-Israelites. That's what this is too, right? Yahweh's looking down on everybody having sex. And how does he know which ones are the Israelites? Because they're circumcised. So he intervenes in the same way that in Egypt, he looks down and he sees the blood on the doorposts and he goes, right, I need to skip that house. Same basic idea here. Okay, my final point for discussion, and I realize I'm going a little longer than usual today. Didn't mean to, it just happened. Final point for discussion is really the tradition of the patriarchal promise as a whole, and really the patriarchal narratives as a whole. Right? Over and over again, God says, I am giving this land to you and to your offspring. Right? And only in that one spot in Genesis 15 is there a hint that this doesn't mean I'm giving it to them right now. The patriarchs spend their time moving around the land of Canaan. They build altars and they make treaties and they purchase burial plots. But if they're just going to leave again in a few generations, what's the point? None of this stuff's ever going to come back in the story. When Israel comes back from Egypt, right, back to this land that they had settled in 400 years earlier, they have to conquer it by force. Right? These claims they made in Genesis, these treaties, these altars, totally irrelevant. Even the burial site where all of the patriarchs are buried, totally irrelevant, never comes back again. Right? So what we're seeing here is an origin story, right? An answer to the question, why do we live here in Canaan? And the answer that the patriarchal narratives are giving us is because God gave this land to our ancestors. Right? The Exodus story is like a different origin story. Why are we here? Because God brought us here from Egypt and we conquered this place. The Pentateuchal narrative as a whole comes in like these two major blocks, Genesis and the rest, that actually don't fit very well together. Right, when you think of it as a story, right? We have a whole story arc in Genesis that then just like disappears. What we have here is an attempt to create a continuous narrative out of two origin stories. It's the Pentateuch is like a nationalized origin myth, one that's created to construct a community that maybe wasn't sort of existing previously. And ancient Israel, despite the biblical narrative, was actually quite a very diverse society. And its origins lie in two distinct groups, neither one of which probably was particularly uniform. One group was native Canaanites. I don't know how good this map is going to be, but native Canaanites, this is a map of Israel, and what you're seeing there, the black circles are Iron Age settlements, that is a sort of 12th to 10th century settlements. So you can see where they all are, right? They're all along that ridge of the mountains there in the highlands, right? So those settlements were settlements created by native Canaanites who moved up into those hills from the big cities that are down on the coast, right? You can see on this map even how the coastal plain is nice and flat and it's very fertile, right? That's where like, Tel Aviv is today. It's very fertile land. And then, you get up into the hills. That's where Israel started, up in those hill countries. And that's why it's because Israel came in part from the coastal Canaanite cities that the Bible goes to such lengths to dissociate Israel from Canaan, right? Over and over again, we're not them, we're not them. They have terrible practices. We're anything but Canaanite, right? But Israelite culture is basically continuous with Canaanite culture, from its rituals and cultic practices to its pottery, right? They're all the same peoples. So that's one group. Another group that made up ancient Israel was outsiders who joined up with these small communities in the highlands. Some of those people may have been from Egypt, but probably they came from all over, right? People who just looking for a new place, disaffected or outcasts or travelers. These diverse peoples with their diverse origins intermarried and started to create a culture and an identity. And as they did so, they also created a single story. Right? And so for some of them, it was, yeah, God promised this land to our ancestors. That's why we're here. And some of them are like, we came in from outside here. That's how we ended up here. And now their national story is God promised this land to our ancestors, and also somehow we came in from outside. I want to close by noting that the patriarchs may have pride of place in the Pentateuch by being first in Genesis, but not anywhere else in the Bible. Right? Mentions of the patriarchs by name in outside the Pentateuch are few and far between. Abraham gets 7 mentions in all the prophets, and only 3 mentions in the Psalms, and they're all in one psalm in Psalm 105. Isaac gets 3 prophetic shout-outs, 2 of which are in one chapter of Amos, and 1 reference in Psalm 105. Jacob gets more because everybody uses Jacob as a synonym for Israel, for the northern kingdom. And the matriarchs have it worse. Sarah is mentioned once, Rebecca is mentioned 0 times, Rachel 3 times, and Leah once. Right? Outside of the Pentateuch, the patriarchs barely exist. The Exodus story, by contrast, is everywhere. And often it's explicitly given to us not as step 2 of a bigger narrative, but as step 1. I'll use 3 examples from Hosea, who's just particularly good about this. Right? I fell in love with Israel when he was a child and have called him my son since Egypt. Right? That notion of Israel started in Egypt. The relationship with God started in Egypt. I have been your God ever since the land of Egypt. I have been the Lord ever since the land of Egypt. What happened to Jacob and Abraham and all of Genesis? Right? The Exodus story is its own beginning. My point is, the call of Abraham, the patriarchal promise, isn't the beginning, it's a beginning. Right? These are stories that Israel told itself to make sense of its place in the world. They're traditions, right? And like so many traditions, they're varied and malleable, and they're put to purposefully here. They're not just recorded, right? They're used. And like so much else, these patriarchal promise traditions, they show us just how diverse ancient Israel was in all sorts of ways. We have 3 versions of this, and they have different angles and different perspectives. So even as we read all 3 of these call narratives of Abraham as part of a single story, we also should be conscious of how they represent multiple stories and multiple perspectives. All right, I didn't go over time. I even left some time for chatting. I don't know what's going on in our questions. Let's find out. Oh, there's a lot. Okay. Let's do the easy stuff first. I gave Deuteronomy 32:8, where the example of the myth of the according to the numbers of their gods, and somebody, maybe more than one person, said it doesn't say that in my Bible. It doesn't say according to the number of gods. It says according to the number of the children of Israel. And this is why I gave you the Greek, right? That the Hebrew tradition, according to the number of the children of Israel, is actually almost unique to the Hebrew. All the other ancient versions of the text, the Greek and also the Dead Sea Scrolls, have it as according to the number of gods. So the scholarly consensus across the board is that according to the number of the children of Israel is what we call like a pious revision. Someone was very uncomfortable with the idea of the Bible saying according to the number of gods, and so changed it into a text that actually doesn't make too much sense. Does they do? Okay. I said that the matriarchs, the not the forefathers, but the foremothers, aren't related. And somebody said, what about in Genesis 20, where Abram says, she's my sister? Maybe, but the issue is that, first of all, that's a unique claim that doesn't appear anywhere else. It's just in that one story, and I think that the other traditions and sources had no idea that was the case. But in any case, the point I was trying to make was that the barrenness in all of the patriarchs' wives isn't like a genetic condition in their family, because they're not all directly linearly related, right? Somehow, they just kind of happen to keep marrying women who have fertility problems, which of course is just part of the larger, um, attempt to make the narrative more difficult for them. How are we going to have progeny? How are we going to fulfill that part of the promise when it turns out all of our wives had to go through fertility problems? Um, uh, wasn't circumcision a common ancient Near Eastern practice? Um, how does God recognize only Israelite circumcision? I don't think that circumcision was a hugely common ancient Near Eastern practice. It was certainly, we know it from Egypt. We have like wall paintings of it from Egypt, but I don't know that Israel knew it, that it was common in Egypt. Um, in any case, what we're looking at with circumcision, of course, right, the story gets it backward, right? The story makes it sound like God said circumcise, so they circumcised. Whereas in fact, it's almost certainly the case that they were circumcising and they were trying to understand, why do we circumcise and others don't? And the answer is, like we're framing it as part of this, right? It's essentially the same, uh, right? So, and again, I don't know that they were thinking of Egyptians. I think they were probably thinking more of the Canaanites, who I don't think we have any evidence of circumcision among Canaanites. But it's like so many of the identifying marks that separate Israel from its neighbors, especially Canaanites, which is to say, circumcision and kosher laws most prominently. Right? We should think about them less as why would God give these laws? Right? What's the sense behind them? And more, how do we understand the fact that Israel was doing these practices already and then wrote those practices into their early history as, features of their identity that they're attributing to divine command, as a way of sort of making their identity tied more closely with their deity. Based on my subtle hints, I don't remember my subtle hints. Are we supposed to understand Abraham as a worshiper of El originally? Right. So this is a good question, and one that I might come back to in a couple of weeks when we talk about Jacob traditions. What I would say is this. The patriarchal cycle as a whole has a bunch of different things going on. The patriarchs talk to and see the God we call Yahweh. The patriarchs refer regularly to the God of their ancestors, right? The God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, with different names. The fear of Isaac is one of the divine names. They talk about El, God, a lot. What's probably being reflected here, and this goes in part to the conversation I was having there at the end about the two origin stories. The name and deity Yahweh, as you can actually see from what I was showing with Hosea, right? I fell in love with Israel in Egypt, and I became your God in Egypt. There's a pretty constant notion that Yahweh becomes Israel's God in Egypt. Like that's the place where that really takes root. And the story that the patriarchs didn't even know Yahweh's real name until then, right? They called me El Shaddai before this. I think all of that reflects, again, the two distinct origin stories, right? Yahweh, that God goes with the Exodus story, right? From Sinai, right? Yahweh comes from Sinai. We have elsewhere in the Bible. The patriarchs who live in Canaan, their gods are the gods of their ancestors, right? All these people who say, I trace myself back to Jacob, I trace myself back to Abraham, right? Who's my God? My God is the God of my ancestor, who was the one who promised my ancestor this land. Was that God Yahweh? Well, sure, we can call it. Yeah, sure. I mean, if we're going to all worship Yahweh, that was Yahweh. At the time, was it? I mean, it may have been that they came out of Canaan. They were Canaanites originally, the ancient Israelites. And their deities, El and Baal, would have been familiar. I don't know. We don't really want to think of it as top down, right? Like they all knew to worship El and Baal because that's, somebody told them to, some authority made it that way. There's probably a lot of local, tribal, almost ancestor worship, but certainly the God of my ancestor worship. Point is, the answer is, did Abraham originally worship El? Not according to the story. Abraham always worshiped Yahweh. The Pentateuch is very clear. No matter what you call the deity, it's the same deity. Even if they didn't know God's real name, it was still the same God. Historically, did ancient Israelites once worship the god El and eventually worship the god Yahweh? In some kind of combination, that's probably what was happening. And again, it reflects just different origins of this diverse Israelite society. Let me think of a couple other ones. Okay. Can I please say something about the definition of various sources that are mentioned in the class notes? Okay. I'm glad I saved this until I had like 2 minutes left to do it. I can probably do this. I have spoken repeatedly of the four Pentateuchal sources that were combined. I talked about this at the end of last time. And we have seen in detail two of them, the one that starts in Genesis 1 and that I represented to you in the flood story with the color red, and the one that starts in Genesis 2 and that I represented to you in the flood story as the color blue. And today I introduced a third one, right, which is the one that appears for us in Genesis 15 with that funny covenant ceremony between the pieces. Those are the three main Pentateuchal sources for almost the entirety of the Pentateuch, Genesis through Numbers. It's just those three. The first one that starts in Genesis 1, we call the priestly source. Why? Because it's responsible for all of the priestly stuff in Leviticus and Numbers, right? All of the like unreadable ritual. I know I'm saying unreadable. I should point out that my mother-in-law is insistent that Leviticus is among her favorite books. So it's not unreadable for all of us, Karen. I don't even know if she's on today. But Leviticus belongs to the priestly source, as does Genesis 1, as does the first flood story, as does the covenant of circumcision in Genesis 17, right? That's all the source that we call P. And of course, there's much more. And we call it P for priestly. The two sources that appear in Genesis 12 and 2 and 3 and the second flood story, that's one source in Genesis 12, and the other one in Genesis 15. We give them annoying names. The one in Genesis 12 we call the Yahwist, and because we originally came up with the idea of thinking about the Bible in German, we spell Yahwist with a J, not with a Y. Why do we call it the Yahwist? Because according to this source, people were using the divine name Yahweh from the very beginning, right? From Genesis 4, when when Enosh starts sacrificing in the name of Yahweh, all the way through, there's no revelation of the divine name. It's just Yahweh. It's the Yahwist. That's Genesis 12. That's Genesis 2, and an inordinate number of other stories. The one that starts in Genesis, the story that appears in Genesis 15 with the funny covenant between the pieces, we call E. For Elohist, Elohist coming from the Hebrew word Elohim, which is the name God, right? So this is in contrast to the Yahwist, who uses the divine name all the way throughout. The Elohist refers generally to the deity as Elohim, God, not by God's divine name, until Exodus 3, when God reveals the name to Moses in the famous, I am who I am call of Moses scene. So again, those are your three sources, J, E, and P, that go all the way from Genesis 1 all the way through the end of the Pentateuch. And the fourth source is D for the Deuteronomist, who is responsible for the vast majority of the book of Deuteronomy, which is its own separate beast for 95+% of it. Them's the four sources, and I will occasionally, now that I've done this, I guess I'll occasionally make reference to what's from what, but it's not super important. for our purposes going forward. That is to say, as I said last time, I don't want to spend the next few weeks just thinking about who wrote what and how we assign texts to various sources. It's enough, as for today, to see that what we have is actually traditions that are picked up in multiple sources and given their own particular spins and their own particular nuances that fit with the overall concepts of their original pieces. Again, the point is not to say this must be J, this must be E, this must be P, and more to say the call of Abraham appears in three distinctive flavors. That's interesting and says something about what the text means and how we might think about reading it.